If you were asked to name 5 controversial figures who stood against the Western powers led by the United States, Muammar Gaddafi would have to be on your list. Even though he was a dictator, many anti-Americans loved Gaddafi for his brave actions against the American administration. As a result of his revolutionary ideas against the Western powers, he was killed in the street like a beggar as the final episode of civil rebellion within the country. In this video, we're going to discuss one of the biggest reasons for the death of this Libyan leader. Before we move on, hit the subscribe button and smash the bell icon for more exciting updates.
It became obvious what Gaddafi was intending to do in Benghazi.
Right now, the U.S. Treasury Department has $37 billion worth of funds that were accessible to Muammar Gaddafi and his regime.
Famous statue in Tripoli. It shows a giant golden fist holding an American jet fighter model. It turns out that Libya has much more gold than that.
Who is Muammar Gaddafi? Born to a poor Bedouin family, he had a very tough journey to the presidential post in the country. After a successful rebellion against the Western-backed Senussi monarchy of Libya, Gaddafi was able to capture the power of the country. Then, he converted Libya into a republic government with the support of his Revolutionary Command Council. Later, he introduced the Sharia into their legal system and promoted Islamic socialism within the country. So, he nationalized the oil industry, and the incomes generated through the oil transactions were used to develop the infrastructure of the country. Within a few years, Libya emerged as one of the most developed nations within the African continent. The former ruler of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, came up with the idea of introducing a new monetary unit in place of the American dollar, which was used for international business. His idea was not limited to introducing this currency to Libya, but for the entire African continent to use in international business, which epically includes oil transactions. This unit was defined by Gaddafi as the gold dinar, and his hope was to remove the American dollar's influence on the oil business, which is a totally foreign currency unit to the whole of Africa. But this was not the first time an oil-rich nation came up with a similar type of idea. Besides Muammar Gaddafi, the Tehran administration came up with the idea of introducing the Tehran oil bourse, which allowed any country to carry out oil transactions in any currency other than US dollars. With the threat of neighboring Middle Eastern nations following a similar trend, the United States imposed several economic transactions, accusing Iran of harboring weapons of mass destruction. But the American administration failed to prove their accusation against Iran, and it's a famous secret that all these actions were against the Tehran administration because of their movement against the American dollar. Unfortunately, Gaddafi's gold dinar idea would hurt the American economy more than that, and they utilized their maximum power to end Gaddafi's regime. The aim of introducing this new currency was to take advantage of the oil revenues directed towards the American banks due to the usage of the American dollar as the standard currency in all those transactions. Main oil producers of the African region like Nigeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Angola already expressed their interest to use the gold dinar for their oil transactions in place of the American dollar. In parallel with the fall of Gaddafi's regime in Libya, the Tunisian and Egyptian governments also succumbed to public riots. All these things are a part of one story of why the United States wanted to wipe out all the forces against the American dollar. These are simply the oil export revenues denominated in American dollars. That means American dollars are accepted as payments by an oil exporter, and there is no distinct currency as petrodollars. This is important as the primary source of income for OPEC countries, as well as non-OPEC nations like Russia, Qatar, and Norway as well. Oil producers prefer to use dollars, as it is the preeminent global currency that is used mainly for investments. Before the 1970s, gold was used for oil transactions, and each country's currency was linked to the value of gold. There was a fixed price for gold at which each country bought and sold that commodity. As there were no sufficient gold stocks, countries faced a huge crisis in transactions. So the gold standard was abandoned, and the US dollar was introduced in its place by the Nixon administration in 1971. The petrodollar system gave an elevated status for the American dollar, as it is the dominant currency in the global economy. So it has many benefits for the US economy, providing consistent trade deficits and a source of liquidity, causing inflow of foreign capital through petrodollar recycling, providing the ability to finance deficits with low interest rate assets and causing decisive influence over global economic markets. Before the civil riot against Gaddafi's administration, Libya was one of the last nations which had its own state banking system and better control over its own money supply. They always preferred to carry out the oil trades in their own currency than going for options like the euro or US dollar. This was totally against the rule that was established by OPEC a few decades before, which agreed to use the American dollar as the standard currency for oil transactions. But using their own currency for oil transactions, Libya achieved a stable economy with minimal currency devaluation and inflation. They enjoyed a huge economic advantage that was utilized for productivity, economic growth, development, infrastructure building, profits for banks, and for the welfare of Libyan people. But Gaddafi's intentions went far beyond that, and he wanted to create a healthier future for the whole African continent. And his vision was a more prosperous African Union like the European Union. But some economists argue that because several factors were not ready in place, the gold dinar would never have been capable of bringing the same development to the African continent that Europe has experienced. Still, it is a debate among economists as no one knows the real effect of it because death came to Gaddafi before his dream of gold dinar came into reality. Peter Koenig, a renowned economist and geopolitical analyst of the World Bank, stated that Gaddafi was killed because of the gold dinar, as opposed to any humanitarian reason. He saw it as the reason behind the intervention of the Western powers in the rebellion against the Gaddafi administration. He had a plan to create a new African Union based on a new African economic system. He wanted to introduce the gold dinar to back African currencies so they could become free from the dollar. He wanted to protect Africa's vast natural resources from Western looting. The imperialists eliminated him, said Koenig. Expressing her views regarding whether Gaddafi's gold dinar had the potential to fail or not, Claudia Boama, an economic analyst at Capricorn Asset Management, explained that the demand for a certain currency is the driving force behind its appreciation. Africa has a lot to offer to the world. In fact, as of 2016, only a fifth of our exports were traded on the continent, while the rest, 80%, were sent overseas. All things being equal, a common continental currency would have a strong value considering the world's dependency on Africa for commodities. As for how the rest of the world might react, currencies have a relatively defined value. If one currency is appreciating, then it is gaining strength against other currencies. Therefore, a currency for which there may very well be a strong demand and consequently strong value might not be received well by those whose currencies currently dominate world trade, said Boama. Even though African markets are rich in different raw materials, they lack manufactured goods. That is cited as a disadvantage for common currency like gold dinar by Boama. Even in the realm of commodities, prices are set by external bodies over which we have little influence, and we trade more off the continent than in it, and unless these factors change, the single currency would be very vulnerable to external shocks, Boama concluded. But Klaus Schade, a research associate at the Economic Association of Namibia, has a view opposed to the prosperity that was promised by the gold dinar. Currently, a lot of African currencies are not convertible. It would take quite a while before markets would accept an African currency. The value of other currencies like USD, EUR, Swiss franc, and Chinese yuan would only be affected if the African currency were regarded as a safer haven. That will not happen in the foreseeable future, not least because the African economies are not diversified or competitive enough, said Schade. He went on to say that gold dinar or any other common African currency does not have enough strength to challenge the other strong foreign currencies. He saw a common African currency like Gaddafi's gold dinar as a threat to the growing African economies rather than a blessing. A single African currency would not help develop the whole continent. We should therefore learn from the experience with the introduction of the euro before we consider introducing an African currency. Anyhow, before that will happen, we need to close the gap between upper middle income countries and least developed countries on the continent. That will still take quite some time. A first step is a regional and continental integration with a strong focus on harmonization of customs procedures, standards, and investment in infrastructure in order to create new and expand current economic activities, Schott explained. In summary, we can conclude that there are advantages as well as disadvantages of going for a single currency unit for the whole African continent. So, gold dinar might not bring the same prosperity to Africa as expected by Gaddafi, but it would surely affect the state of the American dollar, causing more damage to the economy of the United States. That's why Gaddafi was killed before the introduction of the gold dinar. Petrodollars, or US dollars received in the exchange for oil exports, is a main source of income for the US economy over the years. If the gold dinar was implemented, then it would affect not only the American dollar, but also the international gold market as well, causing a rapid rise in gold prices. If Libya tied oil prices to gold, then it would destroy the reserve currency status of the US dollar, forcing the US dollar back to inflation where it comes from. The United States gets a huge advantage through the petrodollar recycling process, and if gold dinar came in place of the dollar, then there would be a risk of flowing that advantage toward African nations. As dollars are used in transactions, oil-producing nations end up with a surplus of US currency. In order to recycle this foreign currency, oil-producing nations lend them to other foreign countries or use them in investments with America or any other nation. So any kind of transaction which involves US dollars generates an income for America automatically. But gold dinar creates a potential risk of losing that automatic revenue for the United States. Outside of the US, France is the other nation which contributed directly to the rebellions against the Gaddafi administration. France had many colonies in Central Africa, and even though their independence was granted, it still dominates their former colonies as the main economic power. So the influence of Gaddafi's gold dinar on the trade transaction would have affected France badly, as they would have lost their centuries-long economic domination in Central Africa. Diminishing the economic power of a Western power like France in the Central African region has an indirect influence on the American dollar as well. Put simply, gold dinar was like a death sentence to the US dollar and the United States, which dominated the world for many decades. That's why the United States wanted to change the Libyan regime as soon as possible. What do you think about the effects of Gaddafi's gold dinar on the American dollar? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel to get updated with more economic news.